It's wonderful 9 o'clock a.m. on Sunday, and today we are going to be creating the perfect pond. Okay. Before I get started, I would like to, as I told Steve just a second ago, is that I'd like to really fill you guys out. I know that sounds weird, but I do. And really what that's going to help me do, and just as I was having this discussion with the gentleman in the back, I think that I can tailor what I'm going to focus in on today as it relates to ponds. And I think you'll get more benefit out of it. And I think, I don't know, I'd rather have it specifically tailored to you guys and what your needs are. Now there are some very much very simple basics that goes along with pond management, and I'll hit all those. But before we do all that, I would like to tell you about myself. So I'm Quinton Phelps. I'm an assistant professor at WVU. I started there summer of 2017, and I'm going to roll back because I think this is important to know that you're dealing with a person that does know a little bit about ponds. In 1998, I started a career with Natural Resource Agency, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. Now that was before they added the tourism. I grew up in Kansas. I grew up hunting and fishing. And one thing about Kansas, if you know anything about it, it's a big cattle state. So associated with those cattle, guess what comes along with the cattle? Ponds, right? So what better for me to learn and see all the time and go interact with are these small ponds that were on various landowners' places. So I fished those a lot as a kid. And I had 20 or 30 in my arsenal that I could go fish, depending on what weekend it was. So that's cool, right? Now some of those ponds, I noticed that some of these ponds had much better fishing than the others. So as a kid, you start to put together, why is this pond doing better than that pond? Why am I able to catch whopper bass out of this pond, and this pond I'm only catching potato chip sized bluegills? That really set my career path in understanding how these aquatic systems, how they were structured and why they were structured the way that they are. You want me to shut this? I'll get it. Anyway, so now with that want and need to understand ponds in my mind, I took a job as a fisheries technician with the state of Kansas, and I worked there for 2 summers with a fisheries management biologist that was very much in tune to helping private landowners out as it related to farm ponds. What do I do when I have too much seaweed in my pond? Please don't ever say seaweed is in a pond. Guess what? There's no seaweed in there, right? I have too many small bluegills. I have a lot of turtles in my pond. Is that a problem? He fielded, and I sort of apprenticed all of these landowners coming to him and asking him specific questions about ponds. And I got to see firsthand, as a kid basically, what this fish management biologist was doing to help these landowners out. And that sounded great. So I wanted to stay in this fisheries management realm. I then went to South Dakota State University to finish up my undergraduate. I worked there with a professor named Dr. Dave Willis. If you search him, he is probably the guru for pond management stuff in North America. One of the saddest days of my life is when Dr. Willis passed away. But before he did, he instilled this enthusiasm that I was talking to this lady about enthusiasm and passion for managing ponds. While I was at South Dakota State, I got a lot of experience working on ponds with Dr. Willis. Again, showed me the ropes, and not so much from a private pond owner asking for solutions, but more from a research component. How specifically are the predators and prey interacting in my pond, and how can I go about manipulating those things to create the environment or create that perfect pond? When I left South Dakota State University, I went to Southern Illinois University, the Salukis. I don't know if anybody knows the Salukis, but anyway, Egyptian dogs, if you were interested. There I was able to create a pond management outreach group, and there I worked with Dr. Roy Heidinger, very much in tune to pond management. I finished my PhD in 2011, and then I moved on to work for the Missouri Department of Conservation, and there I was the statewide research scientist as it related to everything aquatic and fish. So I got a lot of experience working on a lot of different things, including ponds in Missouri. So that's my background, and I guess the reason that I always do that before I come in is that I just want you to know that I have spent a lot of time doing this, and I've looked at a lot of ponds, and I've fished a lot of them too. So, does anyone have maybe a specific thing that they would like to hear about today? Is it? And I know how this works. Everybody's a little bit hesitant to say, "Oh, well, yeah, I'd like to hear that." Yeah.
I'd like to know what to plant around the pond.
Right on.
To make it more productive.
Yes.
And be a better pond for wildlife and fish.
Gotcha. Okay, that's a really good one, and I think we can handle that one. Yes, ma'am.
Segmentation.
Okay.
Ponds.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now we have islands of grasses, and those things just are.
And they float around, or
yeah,
they?
They do move, but they're getting bigger each year.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to know on larger bodies of water, how to promote a healthy ecosystem as well as the diversity by not having catch and release and fishing, which I learned from you before, that you know you need to have that to pull from the pond to have the diversity.
Yeah, and you know what, I want to underscore that, because so many times pond owners are like, they just want to look at their pond, and I am not about that. I'm about utilizing a sustainable resource, and instead of buying excuse my language, crappy fish from the store, I want to be able to utilize this piece of this wonderful aquatic system on my property to feed my family. And I think you can. I mean, I think with a couple specific things that you can do in your pond, you can be eating a high quality protein out of your pond that you're not going to get at any store. So, yeah, good, right on. We'll be there too. Yes.
So if I don't have a pond,
yes.
How do I set things up for a good pond?
That is. I think that might be slide 3. Okay. Yes, sir.
Similar to his. So, what will happen naturally that I don't have to worry about? Yeah. So, and guess what? Relating back to his question, I am all about natural. I'm all about natural. The way that I set this all up is from a natural
and realize that these aren't natural, right? They are man-made, but if we kind of went mostly natural, yes, we'll touch on that. There are a lot of ways to supplement ponds, and if you really want to boost productivity and you want to be able to harvest 500 or 1,000 pounds of protein out of your pond every year, you would have to supplement it. You can't get that naturally. Two big limiting factors in ponds that would limit how much biomass can be removed. One is what? What do you think? What do you think the most limiting factor is to getting more biomass out of a pond?
Size.
Size, right? But what is size related to?
Area, how much area?
Food, depth, oxygen, all those things. The two big factors are food and oxygen. If you can increase that in a pond, you can increase the amount of biomass. Now it becomes unnatural, but it is a way that you can increase that productivity. And in fact, I've worked on a lot of ponds where they do this thing called cage culture. They create striped bass for markets where they will put striped bass in a cage. Now, you may or may not agree with that, and that's fine. Some people like to be able to do that, and they can just go right out to their pond every morning. They throw some food in. It's unnaturally aerated with some oxygen that they saturate the pond with, and they can grow 1,000 pounds per acre of striped bass in their pond per year. That's a lot of biomass. They're adding a lot of food, and they're preventing the lack of a limiting resource, right? It's just like anything else. Okay, yes?
I established a pond 10 years ago on a naturally wet spot.
Yep.
But I got every four-wheel thing I have stuck there. So I used a skid loader, and I excavated it. It was 18 inches deep, about a third of the size of this room. I just had it enlarged to maybe 4 feet deep and half the size of this room. So now I'm looking for what's my next step.
Right.
I had a lot of bullfrog tadpoles in there in the winter. Now I have one large turtle and 6 small turtles.
Yeah.
No food.
No bullfrogs.
Well, the water's muddy because of inwash from the dirt that's still piled up around it.
Gotcha.
I don't know what's in there. So what is my next step?
So just initial gut thought is that 4 feet is not enough. So what can happen is that I was just dealing with the golf course pond in Morgantown, and they had, in the wintertime, they had 4 feet of depth. And what happened there is that, of course you freeze maybe 6-8 inches of the top of the pond. And then if snow comes on top of the pond, it prevents any sunlight penetration from occurring, back to kind of what we talked about. And then what can happen is that if you don't have sunlight penetration, then what happens is that any of the aquatic vegetation that was in that pond begins to break down because it's not photosynthesizing any longer, it's dying. And that's an aerobic process. Aerobic processes use oxygen, and when you use up too much oxygen, then any of the organisms that depend on said oxygen are not going to have a very good day or life, because they'll be dead. So that's the thing, right? We always say that you have to have at least 8 feet along this latitude to be able to sustain life in a pond.
8 feet.
8 feet deep.
Throughout.
No, I'm not saying throughout. I'm saying that you need to have at least pockets of that where you have at least 8 feet. The best pond is one that is heterogeneous in terms of depth. You have some 8, you have some inches. That way you're providing, a range of depth, a range of habitats that maybe different organisms would occupy. Yes?
I have a couple of suspect leach beds about an eighth of a mile upstream from the pond, and every August I get an algae bloom that
Yep.
looks terrible, and I'd like to know the best way
Yeah, so that kind of relates back. I think you talked about sedimentation. I think it's similar there, Steve. I think that, you know, probably 90% of the pond issues that I deal with are relate to sedimentation, and even very much like the question of dredging that I got earlier. But what really happens there is that we have to be comfortable with putting buffers into these zones that are going to prevent excess sedimentation, excess leaching, nitrogen or phosphorus runoff from coming into our pond. But what so often landowners do, and I'm not saying that any of you are guilty of this, but what they want to do is that they have, let's imagine that I have a pond here, and they want to take their tractor or their lawnmower and their weed eater, and they want to take it all the way up to the edge. And in fact, maybe even weed eat the edge of their pond, which is not a good choice. Because what you're doing automatically by doing that is that anything that hits the landscape, there's no time for any of those nutrients to be utilized before they go in the pond. If they're not used before they go in the pond, guess who's going to use them? The pond is going to use them, and then it's going to create something that's undesirable, like algae or excess aquatic vegetation. So that's the thing. Sedimentation, runoff, leaching, all those things, that's probably 90% of what we deal with as it relates to ponds. So, yes.
Mine's a little different than his. We're still designing our pond, but we're on top of the ridge.
Yes.
It's mild and then it gets a little bit steeper.
Sure.
No water source. And so what is available for us to do
Right.
To attract not only the birds but other interesting things too?
Absolutely. And again, I don't know the answer. I'm hopeful that you could create some sort of impermeable barrier that you could create. There's a lot of different ways to do that. In a lot of instances, folks are not, they don't have the privilege of having a water source like you do, but exactly the opposite in that you have to, once you create that pond, you have to do your job to prevent any leaking from occurring. And I'm assuming that you're probably in, I don't know, some sort of rock type landscape.
Well, surprisingly, there's a surprising amount of dirt.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So you just want to make sure that you have that clay base layer to prevent any of that permeation from going on, and then I think you'd be good to go. And then what you need to do is you need to pray for rain.
Well, and something else I'll mention. That
Yeah.
I'm taking half of the downspouts from my house through a 4-inch pipe.
Right to your pond.
About 300 yards, right to my pond.
Huh?
Yeah, we had thought about doing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of folks that are doing that. I think it's actually a decent approach, as long as there's not any seeping from any other nutrient sources before that water rushes into your pond. So yes, sir.
Yeah, I know, because I do that a little bit. Use rainwater.
Yeah.
Plus pH.
Yeah.
pH can go very high.
Yeah.
The other thing I was wondering about was, especially if you're high productivity waste management. How do you, what's the best way to deal with waste management? How do you balance it?
Sure. When you say waste management, what do you mean?
Well, like fish waste, especially if you're feeding.
Okay.
Feeding it, you can overfeed. How do you strike the balance between what's the natural
Yes.
environment there without?
Yeah. So when you start adding these sort of additional sources, whether it's oxygen or food or whatever, your job as a pond manager becomes much more difficult. And that's why I'm with this gentleman back here, is that I always try to go with the more natural system. That way you don't have to deal with that. But I do have some answers for you, and hopefully we'll get into that.
Yeah, filtration.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and I think that goes back to Steve's question, is that, you know, developing these buffers. If you're going to be adding excess whatever to your pond, if you have additional external sources in that you're not controlling, then you have a double whammy going on. So maybe even if you are feeding and the fish aren't consuming all of that, basically nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, not eating all that, and then you have external stuff coming in from ag runoff or whatever, livestock areas, etc. Yeah, you got to control everything else that you can control first, and then maybe you think about toning down how much feeding you're doing. Yes, sir?
I've got a year-round spring that I'd like to turn into a small pond.
Yeah.
To increase biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. All right. Yeah, I think that's an easy one. A lot of times the springs, and I don't know how many folks in here have springs, but springs are really nice because they have pretty water. But the problem is that a lot of times that pretty water doesn't translate into productive water. And so you see these pristine streams or pristine, you know, mountain lakes that are spring fed, and everybody wants to bottle the water and drink it. But the fish really don't like that, right? There's not much in there for them other than just water. So there could be an instance, depending on the productivity, and what I mean by productivity is how much nitrogen and phosphorus would be in that system, that you may have to add additional sources of nutrients to that pond. That's the only problem with spring ponds. The other thing is that spring ponds, a lot of times, or spring-fed ponds, their water is so clear that the aquatic vegetation, if one piece of aquatic vegetation gets in there, and there is good nutrients, the aquatic vegetation can go crazy. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. A lot of photosynthesis goes on, man.
Yes, I live on a 16-acre big pond
Uh-huh.
in Morgantown, and
Ah.
a golf course above it.
Right.
And so we have lots of runoff from their fertilizer.
Yes, I bet you do.
We have aeration systems put in there.
Yes.
We put bacteria in 2 or 3 times a year.
Uh-huh.
It's been improving quite a bit. We have, where the streams come in, we have problems with trying to filter the sediment that comes in, and dredging is, you're beating a dead horse.
Well, and it's very expensive.
It's very expensive, so we didn't know where to get rid of it. It's like, so we need, what's the best type of filtration system we could put in?
A
so
wetland.
that water source comes in to filter through.
So there's something called a two-stage or two-tier pond, where if you have water coming in, you create some sort of wetland, maybe very similar to what this gentleman was talking about. And then down below that, that wetland is acting as a filter that would then trickle down. Anything that was clean could then come down in the major pond. So maybe in that basin, wherever this water is coming in, you could do some planting of aquatic vegetation in there, you could create, I don't know, plant anything that's going to tie into the substrate, tie into the soil, right? And then it's also, the other benefit of that is then being able to utilize those nutrients before they come into your pond.
So even the places that already have like little deltas on them, which they start to grow up reeds and things pretty quick.
Sure.
We could plant something along those.
Yes, yes.
Another.
And I almost think it, you know, if you could put something like this in place where you're actually ponding a little bit of water up there, and then there's some sort of drain out of this ponded area, after it uses those nutrients up, then let it trickle into your pond. Then I think you're going to be in a much better spot.
Yeah, because we have 2 places of big streams that come in and
Yeah.
the problem area, and other springs is up there. These 2, and they keep dredging. I said, well, there's no point in doing it because it comes right back.
Right, and that's what happens a lot of times, is that instead of remediating the problem, we put a Band-Aid on it, and then in a year or 2, you have the same issue that you did before. Yep. So, yes.
We've considered gray water as a source for our pond, but it sounds to me like the chemicals in there might
create havoc with
Nope,
things.
please don't do that.
Okay.
I was in Southern Illinois, and this is a really, it's not a funny story, but I couldn't believe that the landowner couldn't see this. So we go to his pond, and he's got duckweed. Does anybody know what duckweed is? Very expensive to control too. And I'm not I play chemist on Sunday evenings, but I'm not a chemist at all. But I do know that the chemical to control duckweed is very expensive, and I don't know what the specific chemical is. But he was noticing that this duckweed was like just really taking his pond over. And anyway, I remember his house was up on a hill, not on a mountain, because we were in Southern Illinois. But anyway, I remember seeing that there was this very weird patch of bright, like super green grass that like started into the back of his yard, and it followed it all the way down to the pond. I couldn't figure out what was going on. His sewage tank that he had in his backyard, right, was evidently overfull. And what was happening was that it was seeping down that hill and right into his pond. So he had all of these excess nitrogen and phosphorus. I said, I could see it. It almost looked like a T. You know, you had the big tank, the big septic tank, and then it was like a funnel all the way down to that pond. And the grass was beautiful. It looked like a big, beautiful T. So no, don't do that. Yes?
I'd like to know what the optimal population of fish
Oh, yeah,
to
yeah.
have in a pond is.
It varies, but when we think about natural, I got you on the natural, all right?
I'm hearing.
300 pounds per acre, okay? So,
Of what mix?
of predator and prey. And there is a balance there.
Is that all aquatic life or just fish?
That would be just fish. So there's at each level of the food web, which I have a wonderful picture of, and I'll show it to you guys in a little bit. But at each one of those levels, as we sort of go from something really small like plankton to zooplankton, the amount of biomass that is present at each one of those levels as you move up the food web into something that's big and then eventually us, you lose about 90% of the energy or the biomass as you transition from one level of the food web to another. Does that make sense? So if you had 10,000 pounds or 1,000 pounds of phytoplankton, you can only have about 100 pounds of zooplankton, and that's going to keep transitioning up.
Well, right now we have mostly bluegills
Yeah.
in there. We did have some minnows, but I don't see much. Mostly the small ones are young bluegills.
Yeah.
And we have 1 or 2 catfish per pond.
Yeah.
And about 4 koi.
Yeah.
And the population is changing over time. And we want to revise that would be optimal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
It is about a 1/4 acre ponds.
yeah. So I think we can get you there. I
What
think
was that
that
number again? You said the poundage?
somewhere between 300 and 500 pounds per acre. Depends on the
300 to
productivity.
500 per acre.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so if you have a deep body of water, it's fairly healthy.
Yeah.
But it's kind of catch basin. And so you say you have 2 buffers. One that's catching the first that you were describing, and it's got a lot of flora.
Yep.
And then the second is a little deeper, but because of the runoff, it keeps filling up.
Sure.
And constantly dredge it.
Yep.
And when you're dredging your 2 buffers before you go to the lake, or pond, the lake, whatever, what is the optimal depth of your,
The catch, before it goes into the.
yes, so to keep it healthy.
Right, right. So I think that's a really difficult question, a good question, but difficult in that it really depends on how fast the water is transitioning from your, I don't know, tier 1 wetland to your tier 2 wetland. If it's coming from tier 1 wetland at a trickle, tier 2 wetland doesn't need to be very deep. If it's coming in like a fire hose from tier 1 into tier 2, that's got to be much deeper because it needs to protect or really allow tier 2 to be able to do its job as a filter for your lake. Does that make sense?
Yes, and when you have like, massive rains and have huge runoff, and it becomes a catch basin.
That's right.
Or of a watershed.
Right.
To begin with, perhaps. How do you keep that secondary healthy, and what should be in it?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I just know that you're going to have to. That's like that's a research topic, and I don't know without knowing how much rainfall you get, how quickly the gradient of your watershed, all of those things are going to have a huge effect on how deep that tier 2 wetland would need to be. Because I mean that's super variable. That could be super variable. I mean, maybe, the deeper you are, the better it's going to be, because then it's going to allow everything to settle out, and then everything hopefully is coming out from the top into your lake. The deeper, the better, I would suggest, and as many aquatic plants that you can fit in there. And I really wouldn't worry about, because it sounds like it would have a high turnover rate. I really wouldn't worry about having or trying to maintain a fish population in it. I'd wait that for your actual lake and pond at the end. Yes, sir.
Hey, in northern West Virginia,
Uh-huh.
Canaan Valley, what kind of animals would you want to be encouraging to come to your pond, and can you have too many bullfrogs?
I can't think of a pond, or I can't think of a species of wildlife that I wouldn't want to come into my pond. You know what? Otters get beat up a lot because they eat a lot of fish. But otters are really cool.
They're my favorite.
They are. They're like squishy, right?
What about muskrats?
Yeah, I mean, again, muskrats get beat up a lot. I don't know. I mean, as long as there's not 5 billion muskrats in your pond, I think you're fine. I mean, it's just like beavers, everybody wants to kill the beaver and kill the muskrat, whatever. I'm not really into that. I say that if you have too many, I think it's just like anything else. You have one glass of wine in the evening, that's fine. If you're drinking 3 bottles of wine, that's probably not good. So, or maybe it is good.
Well,
I don't know.
I was always told that they'll dig holes in your dam and they'll drain your pond.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, and there are, again, just like with everything, there are those instances, and the people that talk about that are the underwhelming minority that's happened to, right? And those are the squeaky wheels. Those are the ones that always you always hear those. Those are the ones that are always talking about. So.
Isn't that sort of an analogy, though, to the catch and release issue with the fish itself?
Yeah, I mean, it can be. It can be. And now, guess what? If I had several beavers in my pond, and I didn't want to have as many beavers, I would harvest. I would harvest one of them, and I would eat it. They're actually really delicious to eat. So, hopefully you don't think less of me now. But if you do, whatever, that's fine. What's that?
Hey, you love carp.
That's right, I'll eat carp. All right. Yes, sir.
So this discussion is good because one of the things I want to ask you is, will you be talking about holding capacity for a pond.
Yes.
Natural.
Yes. Yes.
So
Natural.
frogs, those kind of things should happen naturally, because if it's a small space, then that's,
Right.
you know,
That's right.
the reproduction. So you can't, the otters, the fishers, the
Yep.
muskrats and those kind of things, you can control those like I say.
Absolutely.
But in your pond, I don't know, I'm asking you whether you have to do anything about what's in your pond.
Absolutely
Unless
you
wanna
do. Absolutely you do.
Certain.
Naturally, it can take care of itself. If you have the right balance of predator and prey, naturally. But you can also, you can intervene as a human consumer. And you can also help your pond by eating some of those fish, or, you know, allowing them to control too many bullfrogs, or I don't know, turtles, or whatever it is. So, yeah. Yes.
I'm never gonna have fish in my pond.
Okay.
Because I have acid mine drainage.
Yes, ma'am.
And so I'm more interested in landscaping, and is there anything that, besides the bullfrogs that'll grow in there?
You know, I don't know. Have you ever thought about trying to use some sort of liming to?
I did. I put in I put in a drain, a limestone drain.
Yeah.
And I tried a dosing system, and yeah, I could go down. I have a.
It's a very expensive process, though.
It's expensive, and it's time consuming, because it's 4 gallons a minute coming in there. 4 gallons a minute, which is pretty good. But I would have to keep dosing it all the time if I was going to try to grow fish.
You know what? I'm going to have to think about that one, okay? So where I'm from, AMD is not, AMD was never a thing, you know? But I have learned so much, and man, I appreciate West Virginia for teaching me about AMD. One really cool project that I've just finished up with a couple of my graduate students is that we're working on Deckers Creek in Morgantown, and Deckers Creek has done a lot of remediation efforts throughout the Deckers Basin to remediate the effects of AMD. And what's really cool is that when you put these towers in, it's amazing how quickly the fish will respond to the remediation efforts. I think we increased the species assemblage records from 2006 to 2018 by like 20-some species by just putting in, by the Friends of Deckers Creek putting in these remediation, or conducting these remediation efforts. I don't know specifically. I'm going to have to think about that one, okay?
And when you said towers,
yeah, so I really don't understand the process on these towers, but basically what it's doing is it's neutralizing the acid.
I know something about that. They take powdered lime and they put it in a big tower, and there's a mechanism in there. After so much water fills up the bucket, it doses a little bit of lime in there, and it fills up the bucket again, and it doses another bit of lime in there.
Yeah.
Does that work for like runoff from, you know, gas, pipeline?
UOG stuff.
Production, yeah.
So those are different chemicals that you're dealing with there. I've got another graduate student that is, so this unconventional oil and gas drilling, you guys are familiar with that? So you're drilling down and then you're kind of going this way or that way. Yeah. So that one, the big problem there is that there are various chemicals that are causing problems, but it's whatever is being pushed down that hole, or some sort of chemical slurry that they put down there, and then that is coming back and getting into the streams. We did a study on some of those streams and looking at the stress response in fish by looking at hematocrit, the relative ratio of white blood cells to red blood cells. what's kind of troubling there is that in the areas where UOG is prominent, the stress levels in these fish are higher. And I know that sounds awfully touchy-feely, like, oh, well, the fish are stressed. But when you think about it from a biological perspective, if stress increases, reproductive capacity goes down, the amount of biomass that can be attained goes down, and then as a result, the rate of extirpation or maybe the loss of an individual species can be more. I think the way that, regardless of whether we're talking about small streams, big rivers, cave systems, whatever, I think the way to think about that, think about the individual fish, and why I like to study fish is because fish act as this sort of environmental indicator of what's going on in the system. If the fish are happy, they're growing fast, they're not stressed, then that means that I'm doing my job as a manager I'm creating that perfect environment, good water quality. And I think that there's a lot of very clear parallels going back to us, because humans have to have a benefit on everything, right? If fish are happy, humans are happy. There's very much the case. Yes?
There's also radioactivity in that process
as well.
But so if I hear you correctly, one of the better indicators of the health of a pond in that sense, that receives runoff, might well be not actual testing the water, but actually biopsying the fish.
Absolutely.
Or doing
Yep.
postmortems on the fish,
Yeah.
and testing them.
And there's very easy ways to do that. One is that we can take the fish out of the pond before eating it, and we can remove, they have inner ear bones. And you can remove those inner ear bones and then put them under a microscope, and you can determine how old those fish are, which is cool, right? Called otoliths. Anyway, we can go to areas that have a good sound, that's the wrong word, they're a healthy system. And we can look at otoliths from those kind of systems, and then we can look at it from maybe unhealthy systems. And we can look at the differences in ages that we're seeing between these two locations with respect to size. So maybe if you're small and you're very old, that may indicate that you have very poor growth in that system. Poor growth is generally a result of added stress, and maybe that stress is a result of excess runoff, sedimentation, XYZ. So I use fish as a measure of ecosystem stability, resilience, an environmental indicator. Yes, sir?
So if I wanted somebody to do a post-mortem on my fish, who do I call?
Me. Yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy to do it for you. I have a lot of graduate students that very much like to pull otoliths and do aging and all that stuff. Yeah.
So they can't be frozen, they need...
No, they could be frozen, that's fine. Yeah. So if you have a few that you want to check. So what we do as fishery scientists is that we have one big book that's basically records from all over the U.S. A bunch of different systems, and then what we have are these averages. So we know how long a fish should be at a certain age, and then we can take your fish from your pond and we can look at it relative to what average is, maybe in your specific county, maybe it's in your specific state, maybe it's in your specific region, and then we can compare it to, to nationwide averages. It's just like looking at blood pressure or I don't know, anything that you go to the doctor to get checked. This is our blood pressure cuff that we put on the fish. So
when
yes.
you talk about structure, in a pond,
Yep.
optimum structure,
Yep.
how much,
Right.
and its makeup.
Right. I have some pictures of that in there. A lot of people don't want a lot of structure in their pond, and I think it's a bad choice. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of your pond should have structure. Structure being could be trees. You can put stick beds in. You can be innovative and use, I don't know, something that you have on your farm already. And then aquatic vegetation is also going to add structure, or add that structure. So, since that was a lot, why don't we take like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes? Let's go 5 minutes. Let's take 5 minutes, stretch your fingers, think about something else, and then I'm going to actually get into my slides. Does that sound okay? Right on.
Yeah.
Is there a roster somewhere for it?
Yes.
Did you check out?
Yeah. Pass it around. Steve, thank you.
They claim they're going.
Yeah, Dr. Burns is a good guy. Yeah, he is.
They got all kinds of detail and then they call. Wait, I got to ask him.
Yes. Oh yeah, lots of it. Yep. And in fact, right at, do you know where, up beyond the Richard mine, do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. We caught a largemouth bass in there. That was like almost like, I don't know. I'm not in on the specifics of that. I'm just on the research side. Because it is. And I'll tell you what, muskies, walleyes, smallmouth bass, all kinds of dinky fish, darters, etc. It's doing well. Yeah.
I have eaten
Are you just good question to get over there?
We had a 10-foot long John boat, and I would have landowners that be like, I don't want as many bullfrogs as I do. Go out there and they're delicious. They're absolutely delicious to eat too. They really are. Oh, are you? Yeah. You can bring them over to my house. I'll eat them for you. So, right. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're even things that you put on the ground.
Very good.
Yeah, we've got place right in front of the window where the bird feeders are. But it would probably freeze in there.
Yeah, but it's not going to freeze. It's not going to freeze that much. I worked with a naturalist in Missouri, and I built a rock in her backyard, and I don't know, it's probably this big, maybe a little bit longer. But anyway, it's probably that deep. And she overwinters fish in it and everything. She's got a bunch of food. Yeah.
Okay.
She's got frogs in there. She's got Jeremiah in there. She named him. And he like comes out and hangs out on top of this rock, and she's got turtles in it. I wonder if I have a picture of that. She's like so proud of it.
Deal. You got to see it.
Yeah, my sister in the suburbs.
No, I'm almost sure.
And she got so frustrated because they bought koi or something like that.
Everybody was bragging
They
because they were
eat it out. And personally, I didn't see any problem with it, but you know.
There's her pond. See her? She's got a turtle. Yeah.
So we have folks still.
See if she's got. Yeah, and there's her bullfrog. She was cleaning it out, and so the frog is sitting on top of the turtle. So anyway, and you can see she has all of her pots, which is a really good idea. And then now in the fall, in the fall you're going to have a bunch of leaves fall into the pond, and in the springtime, wait till it warms up a little bit, till the frog and the turtles get like okay with dealing with. You don't want to pull them out there when it's super cold. But wait until early summer and then clean all the leaves out. And that way you don't have that big bed bug that's in there. So, but yeah, I think I can get the specific dimensions if you want to send me an email. I can get she can tell me exactly the pond liner that she had and everything.
Wow, was it a shape?
Yeah, shape.
Okay, it was shaped, yeah. I keep telling Bill, you know, we've got these poles out there and that's our bird feeding.
Yeah.
And
You'd be surprised.
and I say, you could just do something right good through there.
Yeah. Well, and what you want to do is that in that area that you want to build it, dig it down and dig it down a little bit deeper than what that liner will actually stick in, and then put rocks below it. And that way you have, it's allowing the water to go around your feature. Because if it's solid dirt around it, what's going to happen is that as soon as the water hits the landscape, it's going to eat out the sides. You're going to erode all the way around that.
If it has to come in.
Get you some bigger rocks that they can't move, and then do that fine gravel. I'll have her take, if you want to write down my email, I'll have her send some pictures. You remind me of her, it's kind of crazy. Anyway, it's QUINTON dot Phelps,
I hear the concern.
MAIL.
Do we really know what's going to come out of it?
Yes, we do.
Do
Because
we know how much?
Yes, because let me tell you, then does not allow this.
So the
United States.
I think that there are, I don't give my contact information, but if you send me an email, I can
Pass on it, yeah, I can
Impose here.
much better.
That's right.
They get their own pipeline. They have a half acre pond. They get their own pipeline.
Yeah.
They only have the grass out.
Yep.
We have a lot of ponds, which is nicer than, you know, North Country and everything.
I think you're the west.
We have a good buffer,
Yeah.
but they're not the same person, but we're still dealing with. And I'm wondering if it's the spring fed or but it doesn't.
Super clear. Wow.
But it's changed a lot.
Maybe they do something.
You need someone to come and look at it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll provide my contact information. You send me an email, I'll get you contact right.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah.
Let's stop this dude.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah. It looks like an awesome pond. Wait, I'm gonna talk about that.
He said, how deep do you want it? I said, I don't know, 4 or 6 feet deep. I don't know how deep it is, because it's muddy. So, I'm gonna have to make it a little bit.
I said, yeah.
This is going to be video.
Yeah.
I'm doing well, how you doing? Good seeing you too.
I don't know what just happened there. My computer just randomly shut off. Oh, no. That phenomenon.
Everyone get a chance to sign the log with the sign-in bell.
Did you sign your book? This is
trail. Now we are really here to do. The wife used to complain before you She said this one thing scares you. I said, well, what you're doing scares me. Yeah, I got mine for today, just picturing that.
Thank goodness. I don't know how that came out of that.
It wasn't plugged in the whole time we were here.
It wasn't?
I noticed that. I said, come on, is it charging one from the other?
No. It must have fell out.
What's that?
For a palm.
Yeah, thanks, yeah.
You don't have a water supply.
No, we're right on top of the road.
Years ago, I
Really?
plumbed my house.
Man, that's good.
And then I have a rain barrel.
We have lots of garage.
I don't think so.
Let me go find the technician.
No, I think I'm good.
The overflow couldn't handle it. And I didn't have the overflow. This big went into a 4-inch pipe. It just opened up into the bare ground. I plumbed it into that. When we have heavy rain, I can see that water going into the home.
Yeah.
Nice, clear, clean water.
Yeah, we use the garage water.
Okay.
Gardens, but we could use the rest of it.
I think we'll go ahead and start back up now. And just as I do in my classes, if you have questions as I'm going along, please feel free to like throw something at me, yell at me, whatever it takes. I want to make sure that any questions that arise, you'll certainly be able to answer them. I'll be able to answer them. Not the answers will be right. Okay, so these are the topics that basically we're going to cover. Now there were specifics that you guys had. These really are the big ones. Construction, I'm not going to focus on that too much, but because I'm not an engineer, that's more of an NRCS type question. And then you need to have engineers involved and understand, what your watershed is providing, kind of like what you were asking about. This is the part of pond management that I'm probably the most excited about. And the reason I am is that this isn't me as a kid, but this was me as a kid, right? Hopefully all of you in here can develop or at least think about ponds in terms of our end goal being good pond fishing. And you say, well, that's not really what I care about in my pond. I care more about, having a good habitat where a range of wildlife are going to use it. But, just as I said earlier, when we can put smiles on this guy's face, because he's having a good time catching fish, the other factors, the other attributes of the ecosystem are going to create that. Okay, so even if you don't want good pond fishing, when you have good pond fishing, you're going to have all of the members of your ecosystem working in sync. Okay. Just as it is with anything, you have to plan, you have to know who to talk to. Just as I alluded to earlier, you need to talk to an engineer, NRCS. Those folks are the ones that really understand how water works, how water hits the landscape, how you can pond said water, and really, those people are going to be able to provide you with some unprecedented insight as to what specs or what specific specifications that you need to have. What size watershed do you have? And now the other cool thing is that there are some cost share programs that you can work with the feds to be able to mitigate for potential losses that have happened in the past. There are a lot of programs out there. I don't know those specific programs, but in a lot of instances, creating these ponds on your private property, then you can access some federal funds to be able to do that. This one, the last bullet I have there, don't build on existing streams or creeks. That's really, I think that's more tailored toward a group of naturalists like yourselves. I think that you understand already the benefits maybe of having an existing stream, an existing creek on your property. And then that's going to provide a much different habitat, or a much different, I don't know, yeah, I guess it is habitat, a much different habitat on your property. It's going to be much different from something that you would generate man-made, right? So that's why I'm saying preservation of streams and creeks, that's a big thing. We talked about having the right base to prevent any leaking from occurring, right? You have to have an adequate clay base and a dam core. If you don't, then what happens is that as wind and wave action, if the pond is big enough, it eventually will knock all of that soil from that pond dam. And if you don't have that adequate core clay base, then you're going to eventually put a hole in the dam. Once you put a hole in the dam, then what happens is that you lose all your water. And then you lose all your critters, and then everybody's sad, right? Proper drainage area. Now, you're going to see some, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but think about building a pond in New Mexico relative to building a pond in somewhere that's really wet. I don't know where, Seattle. How big of a watershed do we need to have in Seattle relative to maybe New Mexico? Where would you have to have a bigger watershed? You're right, a way bigger watershed, right? You have to be mindful of those things, and sometimes landowners don't really think those things through. Okay, so make sure that you have a big enough watershed to be able to create the environment that you're trying to create. Oh, and a quality watershed. What do I mean by that? Well, even though I love Iowa, and hopefully nobody from here is Iowa, and they're not going to take anything that I say to heart, but in Iowa, there's a lot of ag, right? And if you are, let's say that I have this, I'm setting in this is my property, and all around me, this mile section is all corn. This mile section is all beans. This mile section is all corn. And this mile section is all beans, and I'm positioned right in the middle. The landscape kind of tapers down to me. When I create that pond right there, it's going to be there's going to be a problem, right? So having a quality watershed with the right attributes is hugely important to making sure that once you do create this pond, after you go through all this painstaking process, that you're not just going to have an algae-ridden, sloppy, gooey mess. Different types of substrate are going to, those are going to come into play. Something like bedrock, going to be fairly impermeable. Something like sand and gravel, those are going to be more permeable surfaces. Got to have that clay base. This is what I think we were talking about this earlier. This pond is 20 feet deep. A 3-to-1 slope or a 3-to-1 pitch is what you need. Why do you think that we need to have that 3-to-1 pitch on the sides? Anybody?
Keeps it from sloshing?
That's part of it. Erosion, right? That's one. What else?
Light.
Yes, that's it. Light. Light's a big thing. If this were too steep or too, if the pitch were greater or the pitch were less, we're going to end up with a greater proportion of that littoral zone. Littoral zone means that area near the bank. When you talk about those littoral areas, that's the area where you're going to have the most productivity. That's where pretty much all of your biomass is going to be tied up. It's not going to be in the, everybody always thinks, oh, I got the very center of my pond, well, that's where all the fish are. No, the fact of the matter is that they're all the way around the ring, right? The perimeter. That's where they're at. So any habitat measures that we do, yes, it is important to have some out in the middle, but don't forget to do that perimeter. The perimeter of your pond is the most important part. In the stream ecology world, they call that the aquatic terrestrial transition zone. And that is where the rubber meets the road in the aquatic world. Yes, ma'am.
3 to 1, which direction? I mean, 3 vertical to 1 horizontal?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
So would this also stand as a metric for the containment pond and itself?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, if you do this, then you're going to, what you should do is on yours, is you should have some sort of PVC pipe that would then feed down up high enough in the water column where everything is going to settle out, and then what's left is going to blow through that. You can open and close that PVC pipe.
What if it's an open concrete sluice?
Yeah, that would work too. As long as it's up high enough up on the dam. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yes.
When you're on karst conditions,
yeah,
at least one pond,
yeah,
I know of, they literally had to line the whole thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there are a lot of lining companies out there now. I think Goodyear is the one that's doing the most pond liners now. It's either Goodyear or Firestone. Anyway, a lot of the state agencies, various parts of the country, they're using their grow out ponds for bass, bluegills, walleyes, whatever it is that they're stocking. They're actually putting those liners in, and it's actually facilitating better growth because the fish are able to get access to all those nutrients that they're putting in. So, yeah, great point.
I heard that Mountain Lake in Virginia has drained completely.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's gone right now.
Yeah.
And that's just happened in the last year or two, I think.
Yeah.
I got a report for somebody who had been there. But for whatever, the bottom went out.
Wow.
And the water's gone.
Yeah.
The lake's gone.
Yeah, that's crazy. It can happen. Yep.
Do they ever put do terracing or anything, or does that really
I don't know that I've ever seen a terrace. I don't know why it wouldn't work though. So are you referring to terracing the dam?
No, terracing like the 3 to 1 slope, like you could terrace the slope.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I haven't seen that, but you could certainly do that, and it'd probably be. I mean, that terrace might be good for, fish are always looking for those flat spots to spawn, particularly centrarchids like bass and bluegills.
And maybe for safety too.
Yeah,
We've got kids in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, good call. Okay. Yeah. So these are common sizes, okay? We're not saying that these are the specifics that you have to do. These are just the common ones. And I'll give this to Steve, and then he can give you guys this. You guys like. There's your.
So that's optimal depth.
Optimal. Yep. Because because there's a lot of really crazy processes that happen as the water transitions from winter to spring to summer to fall. There's these things called turnover that happens, and turnover is a really weird thing. That what can actually happen is that as the water warms up, cools down, the bottom of the lake below the thermocline can be anoxic, and then as that water warms up, and then it goes to the top where all your fish are. Sometimes the fish can't escape that, and then they end up with anoxic conditions, and it kills all the fish. That's why this 8 foot, that's why that 8 feet depth there is important. This is kind of what we were talking about in New Mexico versus Washington. You have to have the right ratio there. Now this is for locations that would be along or in our area. It's going to be much greater, that surface area, whatever you're trying to create. So if you want a 1 acre pond, you need 10 acres of watershed. It's better to have maybe 20 acres of watershed to 1 acre of pond. And it's going to be much different if you're in the arid parts of the country or if you're in the really wet parts of the country. If you have inadequate water levels, these are the things that can happen. You can notice that this pond is in the middle of the summer. Good picture though. You can see that, at certain times of the year, you're going to have good water levels. But then during those periods of the summer, if you don't have an adequate watershed, you're going to eliminate 30, maybe 40% of that overall volume. And by doing that, you're actually creating, you're changing the temperatures here. You're changing the oxygen profile. You're changing the predator-prey interactions that are going on in that pond. You're changing how the aquatic vegetation is growing. You're changing how the bluegill are responding. Changing all kinds of stuff. So if you have this adequate watershed, you're going to end up with more stable water flows. And just a little case history here. The golf course in Morgantown, they were putting in a new sprinkler system, and this type of thing happened in their pond, and they lost all of their fish. So what we're doing now is we've been working with them to try to figure out if the pond is sustainable now, given this new sprinkler system that they have, and it looks like it is. So I'm going to be putting new fish in there before too long. You can imagine that these lower water levels are going to lead to poor fish production. What I mean by that is that, remember I said that this littoral habitat is super important for fish reproduction. If you don't have that, you don't have that kind of habitat there, you're going to have fewer young fish coming into the system. And then if there's any death just due to natural causes of getting old, you're not going to be replenishing those individuals. And especially if you're harvesting fish, you got to have new reproduction going on. And then the worst thing that can happen, just like we said with the golf course pond, is you can have fish kills. If you have an access, kind of like what you were talking about, there are ways around this. And again, you have to create these multi-tiered wetland systems. You can end up with spillway problems, head cutting. This is a really common problem. How can we deal with those common problems? Is that, well, the watershed that we picked, we didn't work with the engineers, we didn't think through the process, we just went out and started digging. The other problem is that because there's such a high turnover in these locations, not even the nutrients are having a chance to be able to be used in that pond before they're shot right through. It's kind of like the idea of Mississippi, Ohio River, Missouri River, any of those. We have channelized those rivers to the point that basically, even though there's a bunch of nitrogen and phosphorus that's running into those systems, It's basically like shooting a fire hose now, right? That's what those rivers are acting as. And when you're that fast, there's such a rapid turnover that the critters can't even utilize those nitrogen and phosphorus resources. So then you end up actually with low fertility. Yes, sir.
So, question on that.
Uh-huh.
Do you always consider a spillway on top, or do you ever consider underflows?
I think you have to have both. I think the best new ponds have some way on the dam side to be able to release water. That's kind of relating to that big PVC thing that I talked about. And then also on the downstream side, you need to really think through if you do have this high flushing of your pond going on, you have to have measures in place where you're not going to have head cutting going on. So that happens a lot, though. Yeah.
It's easy to think about aquatic life as far as the health of your pond. How important is waterfowl to the equation?
In West Virginia, and I'm not going to beat up West Virginia at all, but I don't think it's very important here. I think in the Midwest, waterfowl can be very problematic. There was a study that one of the professors did there, looking at migrating geese, and what can happen in those ponds is that as the geese transition from maybe one water body with some aquatic plant to another impoundment, another pond, they may transition aquatic vegetation from one pond to another. But I mean, outside of that, I mean, you guys know more about the waterfowl in this state than I do, but I don't know that there's a great deal of waterfowl in the state.
Geese.
Canada geese. Yeah.
There's geese and heron, and then you have just the type of birds that like red-winged blackbirds and things like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
And skimmers.
Yeah, I don't know that that's an issue. I couldn't foresee that being an issue.
The geese.
Geese might be it. I do talk about geese here in just a second. And there are ways to mitigate that as well. It's kind of like what you do if you have too many beavers. So dinner, and I'm in. A medium rare goose breast is delicious. So yes.
Yeah. One reason you need 2 outlets on your pond, if you got a spillway, like a concrete spillway, it clogs up. You got to have another way for the water to get out.
Totally agree with you.
So otherwise, it's going to go over the top of the dam.
And then it's going to heat that dam out, and then then someone's going to be really mad at us. Yeah. Okay. This is kind of a gradient, and you can think about a gradient in terms of something that's really good and something that's maybe not so good. This reminds me of the pond that you showed me. Something very nice, maybe even somewhere in here. It's best to have ponds within these sorts of ecosystems relative to something where like we talked about with Iowa, or maybe even something that's more urban. Now, I'm not saying that those developed areas you can't create good ponds, because you certainly can. But it's more difficult. You have to really think through the processes of specifically what you would do to make that happen. But I think for West Virginia, I think we're pretty much over here, at least in most locations. And we do have one additional detail that we have to deal with, is that we do have A&D in certain locations.
We have a lot of chicken houses.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know that there are, one of the fish biologists that I work with, he deals with that quite a bit, and maybe polluting some of the streams. This is what we talked about. Someone asked me about spring-fed ponds. They're good, they're clear. The problem that you can end up with is that you can have a bunch of aquatic vegetation and maybe reduce fertility. There's not a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus that are present in those situations. And that's not always the case, but those spring-fed ponds, even though they're beautiful, may not be the perfect situation for creating the perfect pond.
Didn't you say aquatic vegetation as part of the structure you need in a pond?
It is. It is. I know it sounds really weird, right? So here I'm saying that you don't want, there's a balance. It's a balance. For everything, it's a balance. You don't want none. You don't want too much. I don't know how better to say it.
How do you judge the 30%?
You look at it.
So trees that fall in is good.
Yep.
Vegetation's good as long as it doesn't hit.
What happens is that imagine you and I are swimming around in this pond, and there is aquatic vegetation everywhere. Our ability to be able to navigate and find prey resources is going to be very difficult. But we don't want it to be completely void of vegetation, because if it is, then the prey resource we're going to have, it's going to be way too easy to find them. We're going to eat them all too fast. But if we have a balance, some sort of intermediate level, we're going to have some difficulty in acquiring that prey resource. But we're still going to be effective in eating something. Our prey resource is then, because it's difficult to catch some of them, they're going to be able to reproduce and carry out all of their life history needs. So then that's going to feed our progeny, because they're going to be able to reproduce. So it's a balance. It's a balance. I talked about this earlier, heterogeneity. That's very important in a pond structure. You want some deep areas, you want some shallow areas, you want some flat areas, you want some steep areas, all of those things. You want to have different types of substrates. These sunken islands, those are a good thing. They can provide a wonderful habitat for spawning, refuge from predators, all of those things. These two are the big ones. And remember I was saying 30 to 50% probably what we're looking for. And that's those bottom two. Putting in trees into your pond is a good approach. And then having the right balance of aquatic vegetation, which actually finding that right balance of aquatic vegetation can actually be pretty problematic. This is an example of various woody structures that you can put in your pond. Cedar, some sort of hardwood, that's going to be a lot better than putting pine in there or something like that, because they're going to last for a lot longer. For cedars, you can create these large piles in the pond, maybe before it becomes inundated, before you create that dam, and then you basically know what that structure looks like even before the pond is flooded. One thing that we like to do is take these cedar trees and trim about, cut them down. Maybe it's an 8 or 10 foot tall tree. And then what we would do is we would trim the branches on the base of that cedar tree up 3 or 4 foot up to 3 or 4 foot on the side, on all sides of the tree. And then what we would do is we would take a 5-gallon bucket, fill it up with concrete, and then put that cedar tree down in there, and then stabilize it, allow it to dry. And then you imagine that structure that you have in your pond, instead of laying flat, and you're only really getting the benefit of really 3 sides of that Christmas tree or the cedar tree, you're actually getting the full benefit. Now fish can swim throughout that structure. So if you have access to some cement and some 5-gallon buckets in some of these trees, it's good to place those down in. And then that way, when you set them down in your pond, it provides that full 360 degree habitat. This is just an example of putting some into some farm ponds here. You can see that these are weighted down. I think that's a 5-gallon bucket right there. But anyway, that tree is going to go in. And again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize the amount of surface area that's going to be available to the fishes. Anybody have any questions about that?
Yes? So that creates habitat
Yeah.
Under.
Yep.
Involved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so where we typically use this is in the deeper parts of the pond, where the aquatic vegetation maybe can't grow because sunlight penetration isn't deep enough. So in those areas, we use something like these, artificial structures, not artificial, but artificial structures relative to aquatic vegetation.
Does that guy just pick that up and throw it in?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
You're from Morgantown, there's a big guy in Reservoir in Morgantown.
You know what? I don't know. I hope so. I hope so. If the local DNR guys, Dave Wellman and Dustin Smith, those two guys, I've been in fisheries for a long time. Those two guys are super great people, and wonderful to work with, and I'm sure that they're very much in tune with all of this stuff. So yes, I would say if they're creating a new reservoir, I bet you they're going to be putting some vegetation in or some structure.
With the 3D habitat that you're creating there,
yeah,
does that help to improve the interaction and the diversity?
Absolutely, because you're creating. When you create a pond, it looks like a desert, right? It's essentially a desert. Think about the ocean. The ocean is essentially a desert. Then you see these, you get out on those reefs. That's where all the fish are, right? There's very few open water fish. There are some, but those fish are tied in or keyed in on that structure. So the more of these that you put in, the more likely it is that you're going to have higher densities of fish in the pond because there's more habitat available.
But it's to improve the diversity of the fish that you have.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
They're interacting more.
Yeah, they could be. That's right. Yep. Yeah, it's kind of like what I was saying before, is that if this is completely void of any structure, those interactions, it's going to be out of whack. You put this stuff in where it's going to concentrate those fish, it's going to allow them to be able to interact better. I know it seems weird, but it is what it is. This is something that Aaron Yeager is doing now, and this is he's a fish biologist for Stonewall. This is a really, really cool idea. Basically, what Aaron's doing and what you could do on your ponds is you basically hinge cut a tree, and then basically drill a hole in this tree and drill a hole in this tree, and then you wrap cable around that, let that fall into your pond, and then that's creating a whole bunch more surface area for your fish to interact with the environment. Make sense? Yeah.
Well, it's one of the advantages because it goes all the way around it.
Absolutely.
And underneath.
Yeah.
How tall is the stump part there?
This part?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. It varies, but I would say 2 or 3 feet. Yep.
Why do you tie them together?
Yeah.
So that way it doesn't. That way, this is actually still be alive. So at least it'll live a little bit longer. The longer that those leaves can hang out on that tree, the more structure it's going to provide. And now eventually that's going to die, but for a while it will hang on as alive. Christmas trees, those are easy to find, right? When I worked in Missouri, we had a boat ramp in the middle of Cape Girardeau, and what they would do there is that they allowed people to drop off their Christmas trees, and we would get hundreds of Christmas trees dropped off of that parking lot. And it was really good because then what we did is that we would put all of those Christmas trees in specific locations in the tributaries of the Mississippi River, and then all of the crappie fishermen could go down there and hit all those areas. They were very successful. So anyway, a benefit to both the fishermen and to the state and to the fish. Oops. So, wow, that didn't change. There we go. So this is our structure question. We were saying 30 to 50%. That's what you're shooting for in terms of having that structure and the aquatic vegetation combined. But if it starts to get beyond that point, then your predator is not going to be able to find the prey. Or if it's much less than that, then it's going to be basically a desert. That habitat heterogeneity you're not going to have. There are ways to encourage plant growth. Maybe you don't have enough out there. What you can do is you can create more of those shallow water locations in your pond. And what that does is it provides more of that habitat heterogeneity. You can do some aquatic plant transplants where you maybe have a bunch of aquatic plants here at this location in the pond. Let's say that you want to end up with more surface area coverage. What you can do is you can actually create these big, cages, and then you plant the aquatic vegetation in your pond, and then you put those cages around it. The reason that you do that is that turtles, for whatever reason, they really like to eat aquatic vegetation. And if there's a muskrat in the area, you put some new tender vegetation out there that go to town on. So it's good to, if you're trying to reestablish or plant aquatic plants, it's good to put that cage around it to prevent anything from consuming. Questions on that? What kind of aquatic plants? So my favorite plant is called water willow. And the reason that I like water willow so much is that it doesn't grow beyond about 5 feet depth. It's very resilient to flooding, which means that if it is covered over the top, it won't die. And it's also very resilient to drought. So if it becomes where it's up on the pond bank and doesn't have any water on it, it will still persist until that water comes back.
pH sensitive?
You know what? I bet it's not. It's a pretty resilient plant.
Where would you get it?
I think that there's a couple of people in Morgantown that have it, but I don't know. I know they're right on the mile ground.
Well, we have some willows that just come in on their own.
Not that kind of willow. That's a tree. I'm talking about aquatic plants.
What about buttonbush?
I think buttonbush is a good thing. I do. Particularly not along the dam, but more on the spillway side. Yeah, I think buttonbush is a good one. There's a lot of ponds that and small impoundments that I fished as a kid, where we'd get our waders on in the springtime, and we had long 10-foot B&M crappie poles, and you dip your rod down in that buttonbush and catch crappies where they're up spawning. Yeah, that's fun. Anyway.
Okay, so you're talking about a cage, right?
Yeah.
What do you use for cage material?
Chicken wire works, or you can get the more rigid
Chain link?
Yeah, no, chain link. I think that's overkill.
Hardware cloth.
Yes, something a little bit more intense than chicken wire, but not chain link fence.
So it needs to be fairly small.
Yeah, and fairly small, so where your critters can't get in there. Right? Yep. And just if you guys think about any questions that you have after this. If you have anything, you can find me on the web, and then send me an email, call me, whatever. I'll help you out however I can. So forever, for as long as I'm doing pond stuff and you need help, I'll help you out as much as I can. Yes.
Yeah, and this may not be the right time to talk about it.
Huh?
What about what would otherwise be called a riparian?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Riparian.
Yeah. I think that's a fair word. That's all right. Yeah.
So what might you do around?
So the only thing, this is the dam, right?
Okay.
Up there, leave that alone.
Yeah.
Don't look at it.
Yeah.
Don't even look, forget about that. The rest of the pond, Put whatever you want to on it. Plant trees. I like willow trees. I really do. Willow trees, they suck up a lot of nutrients. They're beautiful. Yeah, willow trees are good. They add a lot of shade to the pond. Maybe provide some of that thermal refugia for the fish. And as much as you can plant down on this end, because it's kind of your job too to think about it this way, is that, you know, you have a pond, right? And maybe someone down lower in the watershed wants to, I don't know, create a pond. The more of the nitrogen and phosphorus that you can use up before it goes downstream, the better, right? So if the more you plant along your pond, the better it is going to be as it relates to using that nitrogen and phosphorus resource. And then when it comes out of your pond, it's going to be, you know, it's going to be basically much lower in terms of those essential components. This is a cool slide. I really like this slide. So this is what I was talking about with food webs, is that in the most simplistic way of thinking about this is that we have sunlight, we add nutrients to that, and from that we create phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is synonymous with the word algae. And then as we transition up the food web, we have these little microscopic plant or animals called zooplankton that would then consume phytoplankton. From there, we're going to have also some other macroinvertebrates that would be present in the pond. But then those are consumed by sort of some intermediate trophic level, a planktivorous fish like a bluegill. It's going to be keying in on those zooplankton. And then we have largemouth bass, or some top-end predator that's going to consume those planktivorous fish. And then we, as humans, if we want to interact with our environment, are then going to be the top-end predator. Now, what has to happen is that, and I always talk about this because I think this is hugely important. If we think about the African plains, and in the African plains, if you think about the base end of the food resource for the plains, it's going to be sunlight and nutrients. Those sunlight and nutrients are going to create those grassy meadows that are then going to be consumed by what?
Critters.
Critters, and some lower level critter. Is a lion going to consume that grass? No. But maybe it's an antelope. Maybe it's a plains antelope that would consume that. And then that plains antelope is going to be consumed by what? The lion, right? So I want you to think about your ponds in that same light. That what